Steve, life in the 70s on drillers, how was that?
Yeah, well, I guess it's a bit different to what it is today, of course. Yeah, started my career as an electrician actually in Great Yarmouth, and in the '70s, if you had breath in your body and you had a trade, then you was very welcome offshore. And in those days, there was quite a significant hike in the rates. For example, a qualified electrician compared to an electrician offshore was probably three times the salary um, that you could get onshore. Plus, you got your time off, of course. So, it was big incentive to go. But in those days, mainly on the drillers. As I say, I lived in Great Yarmouth, and they used to stack drilling rigs in between contracts just off the coast, which were a bit of a tourist attraction. In the summer, they used to put the tourist boats around the rigs. So I actually got a job with a company called International Drilling Company, and apart from myself and two other guys, everybody else was American. So I was thrown in at the deep end, if you like, with the very autocratic, shall we say, you basically were eating, working, and sleeping in those days. Somebody complained once about the state of the settee. There was a small leather settee in the TV room. TV never worked, but there was a small, and it had holes in it. And I remember the tool pusher, that was the OIM in those days. He said, "Well, if you're complaining about the state of the settee in the crew lounge, you're obviously not working hard enough because you should be in bed when you're off shift because you should be so tired." And that actually was the attitude. So you either liked it or you didn't. But I quite liked it, A, for the money, and B, for the time off. In those days, you wouldn't believe it today, but in those days I was a keen footballer, so I could get home, in the time off and get a few matches in and stuff. So it was for me really. So what I did, so the work wise, I mean, if you look at permits to work and all of that stuff, just didn't exist. But you really just didn't know any different. You just watched your back and common sense, but working at height, scaffolding, all of that kind of thing. If I look back now, you think, my God, did we really do that? But you did, because you didn't know any different.
Guys, I'm sorry to interrupt this show, and I really hope you're enjoying it. One thing I'm going to ask you, if you're listening to it and you're not liking, following or subscribing to it, could I ask a massive favour that you do? It really helps the show, it helps me bring in more people, and it helps me get more stories out there, which in favour brings more stories back in. Let's get back to it.
But I got into the groove with the offshore scene quite. As I say, I liked it, and it worked for me in many ways. So, in the South North Sea back in the '70s, you had a lot of. You had three main players in the UK side. You had Amoco, you had Shell, and you had Phillips, and they had, they were putting the gas platforms offshore in those days in the '70s, late '60s, early '70s. That was when the first natural gas was coming ashore, and I applied for. They were hiring all the time in those days because the northern platforms were starting to get built. Oil was getting discovered up in the northern North Sea, so experienced guys from the southern North Sea were getting pulled up to the north to help get those off the ground. And really, the southern North Sea was the cash feed for the north. I mean, they were, huge amounts of money being earned in the south with the gas in those days. It was early days, so the field reservoir pressures were high. There was really quite minimalistic hardware required to produce a whole shitload of gas in the south. So I think at one stage in the late '70s, early '80s, 60% of the UK's natural gas requirements came in at Bacton in Norfolk.
Wow.
So quite significant. And yeah, those little platforms was the kind of ideal place for me, because it was week on, week off. It was 15-minute helicopter ride from the beach. Okay, we didn't have TV, we didn't have you couldn't call home. There's no such thing as telephones. Only communication was by medium frequency radio. Obviously, internet didn't exist in those days. But we used to make our own entertainment. Let's say, the platforms were really small. The 24 beds, probably base crew, of which I was one of the base crew operations technicians, as they was called in those days. So we did operations and maintenance, and you got to learn quite a lot of stuff because, as I say, my background was electrical. But if you was working on a piece of equipment, like let's say a generator, so the electrical end would be my end, but the mechanical end would be, and you'd help the mechanic do his bit, and he'd help you do that bit. So there was no kind of demarcation as you definitely see today, and you used to see in the north with, oh, that's electrical and oh, that's mechanical. We had to do it all because there was no vendor support, there was no telephone to pick up. How do you fix this? How do you mend that? So we really kind of chucked in at the deep end, which I think was good learnings in those days. I'm not so sure. Well, we wouldn't do it today. I mean, it's just
definitely not. That's not my job.
No, exactly. And you don't have all that. You don't have the luxury of, say, picking the phone up and sharing a screen and going through a drawing with an expert. Backup support in the office or what have you. You didn't have any of that. So your camaraderie and your reliance on your crew members, your teammates was really important. I think, as you know, you work offshore as well. You have to be able to get on with people offshore. Now, I'm not to say that all of your workmates that you're going to go and have a pint with when you get home, you can choose who you go and have a beer with, but you can't choose who you work with. But you have to have that certain personality that's able to try at least get along with some of the guys that you don't really get along with, if you know what I mean. It's quite important. But in those days, I was in the 80s, sort of early 80s when I started with Shell. I was I was in my 20s. A lot of the guys, the senior guys there, were probably in their 40s. Because the platforms were only so young, and there wasn't many experienced offshore people there, if you know what I mean, because the platforms hadn't been there very long. I mean, the platforms that were out there were US designed platforms. I mean, in later years, I went to quite a few platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, and they look physically exactly the same as the southern North Sea platforms, except in the North Sea, the legs are a bit more chunkier to put up with the storm weather that you get in the North Sea compared to the Gulf. But the actual kit on board was quite exactly the same. I mean, they designed the platforms in the US and they just plonked them in the southern North Sea and thought everything would be fine. But they quickly found out the corrosion, the North Sea weather, and everything else, and the kit, was not winterized or protected, that it all started to go rotten and fall down. So in the early 80s, much of the work was to upgrade the equipment just because it was simply falling apart. So it was busy. They were busy as soon as they went in. But yeah, I mean, the camaraderie, I think, is the thing that sticks in my mind after all these years. Is some of the tricks we used to get up to. I mean, you talk about horseplay, and so, well, I mean, it wasn't. It was more calculated horseplay. I mean, I can tell you a little story that. I mean, we used to do silly things like, get into somebody's toolbox by sliding the cantilever hinge open and open his toolbox and put a couple of fish in there or something. So when he came back on shift a couple of weeks later, he's got that. Or I had mine bolted to the deck in the workshop. So I went to pick the toolbox up and it wouldn't come because somebody had been in and had drilled and tapped I mean, you just wouldn't get away with that these days. But,
Absolutely
but
not.
they were calculated ones. I think the best one for me was one day. In those days, the cabins were 4-man cabins for the base crew, and you had like an ensuite shower. I mean, going back to the drillers, the shower room was down the corridor, and it was for 20 people. But at least we had a shower ensuite shower room for 4, and you shared the cabin with the same guys each week, and you take it in turns to go and have a shower and what have you. And I remember going up for a shower in the evening and standing there, and as you do, scrubbing around, and something cold hit me on my chest. I thought, what the hell is that? And I looked down, and I was completely purple. My whole front of my body had turned purple. And I leapt out of the shower, and I don't know what it was, because I think that day I'd been working with diesel. And I thought, oh my God, I've got diesel all. What's this coming from? And I looked back in the shower, and in the centre of the shower, coming from the top of the shower, was this stream of purple liquid. What the hell is that? I looked up past the shower and into the ceiling, and the ceiling was one of these ones with, a false ceiling, with the tiles that they lift out. And it was a plastic tube, and it was running up into the ceiling and away. So I ran out, stark bollock naked, covered in this stuff. It wouldn't come off. It was absolutely just, the whole front of me is purple. And I'm in the in the cabin, and I'm looking around, nobody there. Open the door up and look down the corridor, nobody there either. Go into the next cabin along, and there's a guy who's no longer with us now, standing on a chair with a big bottle, squeezing this purple stuff into a tube and into me. And it was food dye.
No.
It was purple food dye.
Stuck on there for ages.
But anyway, for weeks, actually. It was stuck on there for weeks. And just think how long that must have taken to rig that that crank up, I'd done something to him. I can't remember what it was, but that was his retaliation, and that was so tricks like that, so you had to keep your wits about you all the time, and but those things, made people a lot closer and helped people out when they were stuck on a job, or you wouldn't hesitate to go help somebody, and they wouldn't hesitate to come and help you.
So when did you start with Shell then?
I joined Shell in late '79, so and I first went out to the Indefatigable field, which is not there anymore. The platforms have been removed in the late '90s, but at that time there was 3 platforms in that field, the Juliet, Kilo, and Lima platforms, and they, like I say, they were the Juliet and the Kilo had a accommodation, I think, about 20, something like that, and the Lima was that went out pretty much at the time I joined Shell, actually, because they did a lot of the construction work for that platform in Lowestoft, which is just south of Great Yarmouth. So it was a small field, and the whole crew change for the Shell people was done on one helicopter for the whole 3 platforms. So they used to do. Sometimes you would. I mean, I've been on Lima platform, for example, and landed on a Thursday on my crew change flight, and the next helicopter was the following Thursday on my crew change flight. So you'd go the whole week without a helicopter. That wasn't common, but it did happen. But one of our forms of entertainment was, in those days, you had the old 16mm films, so you could get a movie, watch a movie, and you had to manually rewind the film and all of this stuff. But it was, again, it was film night, and I think we had half a dozen films, or maybe 4. I can't rightly remember now. But you used to share them between the other 2 platforms. So those days I was on the Kilo platform, so J and K would also have a move in. You'd swap them around on the helicopter. Well, if you had no requirement for that helicopter to come to your platform, so you'd check the helicopter routing, and let's say you wanted to go from K to L to J as an example. The routing may have been the other way around for some operational reason, but we had this 2-inch blind flange that used to travel around the field, and you would say 20 pounds of freight needed on the Lima from the kilo. And the Lima would say that they had £20 of urgent freight from the Lima to the kilo, just so it was in the right direction that you could swap the films over. They would otherwise you didn't get to see the movie, and that would be a big highlight of the evening, of course. So the blind flanger was a very well travelled piece of equipment in the
There's
1980s.
absolutely no chance that's happening these days. Not with the cost of choppers.
Absolutely not. I mean, if you look back to those kind of days, I mean, we didn't really. It's quite strange, really, because obviously through the years I climbed up the food chain, and I've been involved a lot actually in OPEX reduction exercises and efficiency and changing the ways of working offshore and so on. So I'm quite acutely aware these days of what costs are. And I was probably, after 15 years or so of my time with Shell. But in those days, you didn't have any cost awareness because nobody shared that with you. You didn't have, well, I mean, it was obvious that we were funding, these northern platforms, as I say, but you didn't know how much the thermogas cost. You didn't know what your OPEX expense for your platform was. You weren't involved in any of that. But in my days as an offshore installation manager, much of my time was spent up with budgets, which you didn't have in the early days. I mean, your catering budget, your OPEX budget, your maintenance budget, all of that now is at the forefront of leadership in those places, whereas before it wasn't.
How did your climb go? So obviously started off at ops tech, and then obviously you take the step. How long, and how did that go?
Well, like I say, it's I was fortunate enough to join Shell. I spent 40 odd years with Shell. They do have a hierarchy. They still do. And in the southern North Sea, basically, it starts off and it's financial. You start off as an operations technician, you move to a senior technician, then you go into supervision, ops supervisor, and so on, and then off you go up the thing. But there were some physical things that you needed to do to go, and Shell has a salary job group salaries. So I joined Shell as a job group 7, and then as the numbers go down, actually, the lower the number, the higher up pay scale you are. But in order to progress to a job group 6, you had to physically work and have competencies in certain pieces of equipment. And in the southern North Sea, those pieces of equipment weren't all in one place. Obviously, up north on the Brents and the Dunlins and so on, that all of that kit that I'm talking about was all on one place. So maybe spend a year on gas dehydration and another year on compression and another year on this piece of kit and that piece of kit. So we had to kind of move around locations, and that was dependent, obviously, on leadership and supervision as to how you went around. If your face didn't fit, you were stuck in one place for one long time, and you just weren't going to move up the pay grade salaries. Fortunately for me, I was moved up to job group 6, and that usually took 3 years. And I moved into Bacton, so I worked in the indefatigable field. I went then into the Le Mans field on gas compression, and then I went into Bacton where I got my first promotion. Did some time in Bacton, and then went back offshore again. And that was then just post Piper Alpha. And there was a huge amount of work done offshore, especially on those platforms, as a result of Piper. But what Piper also did, of course, was around the training for management of major emergencies and the competency requirements for individuals. So, the training and the competency departments within Shell geared themselves up for natural progression for staff. So you didn't suddenly become an OIM because you were a good electrician and you done really well at that job. You had some much more formal competencies that you needed to have in place before you moved up. So again, I I did all of those. I did some mature studies as well, Open University and so on, which has helped me in some of the management and leadership roles that I've taken, as we've moved on. I guess some of it's being in the right place at the right time. There's a OIM moves on or leaves and retires, I'll give that to Fennell, or, and I think the other piece is that I was, again, in the 90s, not only did we have many, many physical hardware modifications to do to the Southern North Sea platforms because of Piper, things like installation of subsea surface valves, a lot of hardware requirements, and also the safety case regulations as well, because if you remember, one of Cullen's recommendations was that the Department of Energy was not a good regulator for offshore because they had conflict of interest. Absolutely correct. So the safety case regulations came in, which became more goal setting and target setting as opposed to prescriptive setting. So the operators really had to set their own targets with regards to providing and demonstrating to the regulator that their installations were safe and the risks levels were as low as a LARP, as they call it, as low as reasonably practical. So a lot of physical modifications were done in those days, which required, people to slightly step out of their comfort zone and do jobs that, concurrent operations. You had accommodation vessels alongside platforms which were still producing, and so there were opportunities to, diversify in what jobs you did, which is what I did, of course. So I got involved a lot then in the 90s because the OPEX squeezes were coming along. We, things like some fundamental things for cost cutting were like moving from week on, week off to 2 on, 2 off, for example. You're saving over a period of a month, you're saving on one person, you're saving 4 helicopter rides. Demanning of a lot of these platforms was a big thing in the 1990s. As I said, they were quite small platforms. If you look at the platforms, why are we on this platform? Well, we're there to produce gas. Okay, what if we automate the production of gas? Why do we need to be there after that? Well, we need to do maintenance. Okay, what equipment are we maintaining? And I'm being a bit broad with this, but I mean, okay, the equipment we're maintaining, most of it is because there's people there.
Yeah,
we're maintaining helidecks because we need helicopters to land there. We're maintaining HVAC because we've got an accommodation. Do you see what I mean? All of this equipment.
Breaking it down as to what needs to be really there and not.
Correct. So if you cut that equipment out, all of a sudden, you can calculate, well, we only need to be there every 6 weeks for a week, and we can do the maintenance, and it can run automatically. Well, in theory, that was great, but some of these platforms by then were 20 odd years old, and when the studies for demanning were carried out, what they missed was things like the operator going around every morning tweaking a valve or draining a little vessel, or all of the the little Russian dust up. Yeah, which was never sort of recorded in any maintenance system or anything. So once that tender loving care disappeared, the reliability of the platforms became extremely bad, and in some cases awful. So they had to introduce what was it was a choice terminology, a choice acronym was thought up by some clever guy in the office. We'll call them the fart squad. So we had this fart squad, which was fast acting response team, which obviously the connotations in the offshore cynicism and sense of humour of being a member of the fart squad was quite funny. But basically what that meant was that you had a team of guys that were based on one of the bigger man platforms, and they would be the fast response to these smaller unmanned platforms. So I was a member of one of those teams, eventually headed up one of those teams, and we would look after half a dozen of the unmanned platforms. We would go out on regular visits to maintain them, but also to go and reset them when they fell over, because some of them were extremely unreliable, and you could perhaps guarantee that at least every other day one of these platforms would trip and you would have to go out and reset them. As technology moved on, of course, we started to build platforms from scratch that were designed to be unmanned. So the reliability came along with technology. And then we started to build platforms where there are no helidecks, for example, because we introduced a different way of working. So walk to work was a big thing. That's something that I was involved in right from the very start, actually. We were a team of us were pulled into the office to look at new ways of working. It was basically the header, and it was kind of a blank sheet of paper. Say, right, what can we do to significantly, we've got to a point where we've reduced the OPEX, we've demanned these platforms, we're operating with lower numbers of people, at a cost, like I say, with the reliability and so on. But we need a step change, because otherwise, you reach that curve where your operations costs and your gas production hit a point where Shell say, well, it's no longer economically viable for us, although there's a huge amount of gas left in the ground, but the operating costs are too expensive. So we looked at various things. For about a year and a half, I was involved with this. Actually, we were looking at maybe having some kind of a campaign maintenance vessel, which was a self-propelled jackup, which you have, ironically, they're there now with the wind industry more than the offshore industry, where these self-propelled jackups sail along, jack up, do a bit of work, and then go again. Unfortunately, the cost, the capex for we actually went out to tender for one, actually, but the grown-ups in the end pulled the plug on it because, well, the oil price dropped at the same time.
Oh yeah,
bad timing. But the Kraken, which was a vessel that was built by a company called Seajax, which was one of the first. Well, they did use it actually in the Southern North Sea, but for oil and industry, but it was predominantly for wind. But that basis of design for that vessel was written by me.
oh really?
Because we wrote the basis of design for a self-propelled jackup, and the company that won the contract used that basis of design and went off and built the Kraken and many others after that. So so that was quite ironic. But again, so the self-propelled jackup didn't really fly, but the whole walk to work concept was the step change. How can we get people to walk to work? How can we cut out helicopter flights, which is a huge cost, and therefore, if you have no helidecks, you don't need firefighting on the helidecks. You don't need. So how can we do that? So at the time we looked at the self-propelled jackup, there were a couple of companies that were developing this heave compensated gangways, and they were really in the R&D phase of the development. And we looked at two different heave compensated gangways. Ironically, the one that's really got the market today is the Ampleman. But at the time, the Ampleman was in a warehouse in Rotterdam, and the founder of Ampleman was still tinkering away with gyroscopes, and it just didn't. It was too early for us anyway. So we went with the competitor of the time, and we put the heat compensated gangway on a ship, and we operated that ship for 5 years in the Southern North Sea across UK and NL. It was the Smith Camara. And we ran that for 5 years. So I helped get that developed. I actually was the offshore coordinator for that, so I looked after it for for 4 of its 5 years until it came off contract. After that, Shell moved to the Ampleman. I wasn't involved in that then. I'd moved on overseas, but even today, Shell have 2 vessels on contract with Amplemans installed, and they use them to walk to work. So the guys turn up at Great Yarmouth or Den Helder, depending where the ship is working, on their crew change day, and they're on the ship for the 2 weeks, and they go to the various platforms, walk to work, come back on the ship at night, and eat and sleep, and then carry on the next day. So it was a big task to win over the staff, I would say, in those days. I mean, it's quite ironic, really. If one of the stories, I actually had to go offshore and try and promote the concept successfully, I'm pleased to say. But I often used to say, well, imagine we started this offshore industry and people went to work on the platforms from a boat, and then 20 odd years into the industry, we say, oh, by the way, we're going to stop that boat, Lark. We're going to fly you there on these helicopters that are noisy and cramped and fall out of the sky occasionally. Instead of, your feet on the ground walking across a gangway to work, can you imagine what the reaction might have been? But the reaction was that way when we brought the walk to work concept. Thankfully, we had enough people. We did it on a voluntary basis to start with, and thankfully we got enough volunteers, and many of them are still doing it now, which is 20 odd years later. They're still walking to work. So that was and it did. It gave the Southern North Sea its lease of life, and it's still there. I mean, the not all of the platforms are still there. Some of the fields are exhausted now, but there's still many, many platforms offshore, and many of them are unmanned, and they walk to work. So that was quite a big step change in the way they do things down there.
Well, it's obviously it's moved into the wind as well, because obviously they use SOVs for their wind farms now. Obviously going around and getting the Ampleman, or obviously there's a few more companies now I've seen that are doing the walk to walks.
Yeah.
Bridges, should we say? But where did you go after that? Because you mentioned there, obviously you went global when Ampleman came in, and where were you set off to on your travels next?
Well, so what I did is, again, as part of one of the cost-cutting exercises, Shell closed the Lowestoft base, and they closed a base in Netherlands called Velsen, because there was 20 odd platforms on the Dutch side, 20 odd platforms on the UK side. Okay, they're all gas platforms. Some feeds into Den Helder and some feeds into Bacton, but let's operate them all from one place. So they closed up those offices, let a lot of people go home, and set up camp in Assen, just south of a city called Groningen, and operated east and west one gas. They called it one gas, one entity of UK and Dutch. And I was fortunate enough at the time. I was working on the UK side, as I say, looking after unmanned platforms, and they gave me a job in this new Assen office, but looking after the Dutch platforms. So same job, but instead of looking after some UK platforms, they assigned me to some Dutch platforms. Might think, okay, well, that's fine. They're all the same. They're all gas platforms, and technically they're not quite the same, because they follow a different legislative requirements, because the laws are slightly different, UK and NL. But the fundamental difference is that the platforms were full of Dutch people who didn't want to see a big fat Englishman coming across. What's this bastard doing over here, taking all our jobs away? So I quickly had to learn Dutch, because
Good on you, because they love that. They do like that a lot.
Absolutely. So I ended up. I was here I actually live in Netherlands now, but I was here for a 3-year assignment, which turned into 9 years. So that I must have been doing something right. I spent 9 years based in the Assen office, and this actually that's where I did all the walk to work stuff. Was from the Assen office, as I was contract holder for the Smith Camara and also some jack-ups as well. We had the Sea Foxes, a couple of Sea Foxes. In those days we had 50 platforms to service, so UK and NL. So it's quite a busy time. But that model of one gas actually, up until very, very recently, stayed for, since I think it was 2002 I came over here. So 20 odd years, that model of working across the borders stayed. But Shell have just sold their piece, and NAM have just sold their piece. So they've kind of separated again, I think. But I do think something like the Kronborg vessel, which is the Ampelman vessel, still goes cross-border, I think. I'm not 100% sure, because many of the guys that I worked with in those days are no longer there. But so that's where I first started overseas. And then, like I say, I was there for 9 years, and the Shell HR police finally caught me out because they had a rule with the Dutch government that expats shouldn't be there any longer than 6 years, because if you can't train a Dutchman up within 6 years, then you're taking somebody else's job, if you get me. So I had to leave, and I went to the west coast of Ireland then to a project called the Corrib project, which is a gas site in Ireland. Very well documented project. If you check it out on Google, that it was a facility or a project that was initially set up with Enterprise Oil, and Shell bought Enterprise Oil and consequently bought the Corrib project as it was then. But there was a huge reaction to the project with protests and so on, which delayed. The project should have taken 4 years. It took 12 in the end. It took 12 years and 3 times the cost. But I got there. Fortunately, I got there towards the end. I was actually plant manager there and involved in the commissioning and the start-up of the thing. But the issue was all around pipelines. There's been TV programs about it, and there's I'm sure if listeners go onto Google and Google the Corrib project, it was very controversial. And what I would say is that, my career has all been about technical stuff and hardware and what we've just been discussing. But that project, I learned more about non-technical stuff than I ever have before and since. Learning a lot about yourself. It's a very, very small community over there in the west coast of Ireland. I've got some great friends over there, nothing to do with work, but people that, Irish folks that lived in these little villages. And so that was another chapter. Then I got the best job I never had. I was finishing at Corrib. At its height, there was several hundred folks there, and I kind of figured if I could leave before everybody else did, that I could get a new Shell assignment before the rush. And I did a deal with the boss, and as soon as we got gas in the pipes, I could leave. And so I applied for a job, one of Shell's joint ventures in Oman, and they were going through the visa process. Everything was going fine, and it came to light that the job disappeared because they were going to give it to an Omani national. So I dipped out. So there I was without a job, which was quite scary. But fortunately for me, a couple of days later, a telephone call came from a gentleman, again, who's no longer with us, sadly. But Shell had a joint venture in southern Iraq, in Basra. But I was to be based in a place called Dubai. So I spent almost 5 years living in Dubai, working in the back office for this joint venture in Iraq, which was the best job I ever had. So Oman was the best job I never had, and Dubai was the best job I ever had. So I was there. I used to commute into Iraq about every 6 weeks, something like that. And moved from there, and I ended up in Sakhalin Island, which is another Shell joint venture. And then I became ill. So unfortunately, in 2021, I had to stop. Um, Quite a serious illness came along, and it wasn't looking too good for quite some time. I won't go into detail there too much, but ended up having a stem cell transplant, and touch wood, I'm in remission and things are going well again. And very quickly after the transplant, realised, and as I became well again, um, decided retirement wasn't for Fennell. I don't play golf. Strangely enough, I'd given up my drinking habits, and so I didn't even go to the pub in those days either. Still don't. Um, and so, I thought, what the hell am I going to do? So I touted myself around to some old ex-colleagues. Have you got any work? Have you something I could help you with? And I started off by doing a bit of document review for a good friend of mine in the Middle East, and writing some procedures and helping him with invitations to tender for some work, commissioning, start-up work, and so on. And it started off on that kind of as and when type set, and now I have a consultancy company, and well, I'm as busy as I want to be, because it's amazing how much work is actually out there if people find out that you're around. And I'm currently doing some work for another ex-colleague. Well, he's not an ex-colleague because he's a colleague, but his consultancy company, and I've been helping him for a couple of years with some clients working on the operations management systems. So, going in the field, doing some audits, and helping write and review documents. So it's enough for me to keep me happy, keep my brain engaged, and obviously, well, money's not bad either. It's quite handy.
That helps a lot. How was it going from
Yeah.
Shell's machine, would we say? I mean, because coming from a family that was part of it, how was it going from that to freelancing on your own? Because Shell's massive at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because you're absolutely right. And having worked for them for over 40 years, even if I go back 40 odd years to the days when I was a hairy ass contractor on the drillers and on the Amoco platforms in the southern North Sea before I joined Shell, I tried never to forget that I was once a contractor. But if you're, 40 odd years of insulated in the Shell bubble, as it's often called, with the hierarchy, with the slow, decision making processes sometimes is so painfully slow within these big companies, that moving from that to seeing some of the clients that I've been fortunate enough to help work for in the consultancy, and the flat organizations, and how decisions can be made quickly and put into action quickly compared to the Shell machine, as you call it, is amazing. It's like a breath of fresh air for me. It's actually one of the things that keeps the enthusiasm levels up, because you can come with your experiences, and you can come with suggestions, improvements, these kind of ideas that you know from your own experience, and they can, before you know it, they're actually they've adopted some of those, and they're using them. Whereas in the Shell world, it probably take you a couple of years to get that through, with so many knockbacks, and you try a different route and try this and try that. So that's one thing. I guess on the negative side, you don't have somebody to go and collaborate with so much in the consultancy world. You know, there's always somebody in Shell that you can pick a phone up or ask, you know, questions. What do you think about this? What do you think about it? From a technical point of view? I mean, I was a technical authority with Shell. At the end of my career, I was the offshore technical authority for operations in Sakhalin Island, you know, and if they wanted to do some, let's say, some out of the box type things from operations point of view and process safety point of view, there was always somebody within Shell somewhere else in the world who could pick the phone up and say, hey, you know, we've got this situation. What do you think? Whereas in the consultancy world, you haven't got that.
No.
You know, you're shooting from your own hip. But that's okay. That's you live by the sword, die by the sword. Eh?
Is there anything that sticks with you quite a lot though from your career, that you kind of that you took away from being at Shell though?
Yeah, I guess. Well, I guess I can be philosophical around, like I mentioned right at the beginning, is some of these characters that I met and lived and worked with, and I would say slept with, but that might be taken the wrong way. But you know what I mean. Uh, but
Especially
as
in
a
four-man
youngster,
cabins.
yeah, exactly, yeah, and eight-man cabins.
Yeah.
I've had some of those too. But as a youngster, you know, so as an impressionable youngster, I guess, you know, some of those guys you're working with it in early doors, you know, that you had respect for. So very that a lot of takeaways. I can think of a lot of people, not many, but I can think of a lot of people that have had an influence on my life because of, you know, because of their, well, coaching or copying in some cases. So that's one thing. And I think from a professional point of view is the introduction of the walk to work in you know, in offshore operations and indeed in other operations, because the whole walk to work concept is key in the wind industry offshore, I'm sure. But so I guess that's the thing I'm proud of, that I can say that we changed the ways of work, and it's safer. You know, it's the figures speak for themselves on individual risk. You know, walking to work from a ship or flying in a helicopter, there's huge numbers differently, and obviously, you know, having had experience of, you know, helicopters falling out of the sky as well, and the consequences of those compared to incidents at sea, you know, is fundamentally different. So I guess they're the two big the two big things for me, Joe.
What do you hope for the next generation of oil and gas? So obviously, oil and gas in the UK is very well documented. It's not having its greatest time, shall we say? Um, but what are you hoping for the next generation of what might come through, and or what might not at this rate, actually? And but what would you
Yeah,
what would you what would you say, especially considering the culture, 60s, 70s was obviously the boom days for down in the southern sector before obviously North kind of took the headlines, should we say? Um, so obviously the culture changes that you've been through all that time as well. But what would you kind of hope gets taken from kind of people listening to yourself that are in the industry now?
well, first of all, I would say that there. I mean, we won't get embroiled in the political nuances of what's happening at the moment, and you know why a lot of the bad press about oil and gas is around. But I believe that you know the industry is still here for a long time. It has to be. Now, UK North Sea you know, might be a bit behind the game because of the various political situations that it's in with revenue tax and so on and so forth. But I believe there's still, you know, for somebody leaving school today, for example, or embarking on a career, I know it's a dirty word, fossil fuel and oil and gas, but the world needs it. And, you know, there is a place for the renewables and all of the green energy. Of course there is. And you know, that is the future. But oil and gas still has a future, and I think anyone leaving school today or coming up to making career decisions can have a long, successful career in the industry. If I look at my career in the industry, and if I look at the material things that I have, my family has, and the things I've seen and done, is all because of the offshore industry, or the oil and gas industry, I should say. And I still think that that applies today. We have these swings, high oil prices, low oil prices, companies pulling in budget, lower cost operators taking over stuff. But there's still a lot of infrastructure there. There's still a lot of oil and gas to be produced. We need it around the world, and obviously once we've finished, it's all got to be decommissioned. So there's a huge amount of work there. Obviously, the industry is totally different, as we've just said, today compared to what it was. But I think there's opportunities, exciting opportunities around the world still, and those somebody like yourself, for example, is that going strong, come from a family where you saw the industry as you're growing up, and hopefully your kids will as well, and I think your kids could. I think there's always going to be a requirement to get these fossil fuels out of the ground, and so go for it, I would say.
What's the proudest moment of your career?
Oh, that's a hard one to say. Well, I don't think I've got a set moment. What does make me proud is, quite a few of the folks I've mentored over the years, how they've progressed and gone on and to greater things. That gives me a buzz, and still does actually, to see some of the youngsters that you've helped along the way. 2 or 3 of the folks that I mentored. Some are still within Shell, for example, at very senior positions, and others not. And so that makes me proud that, and for them to thank me. When I left Shell, I put a farewell note in LinkedIn, actually, because at that time it was, well, we did, it's the illness that I have. I still have it, actually. I'm, as I say, in remission, but it didn't look very rosy. I mean, I say I don't want to be dramatic, but one of the things was, so I put this farewell note in, and it kind of, in my little world, went viral. The amount of comments and remarks that came back, and some of those remarks, I sat and read them with tears rolling down my face on some of them. Sounds a bit soppy, but what people actually thought of me, and how I've helped them, and so on and so forth. That makes me proud, So there's not one specific moment, I don't think.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to finish the show as well, Stephen. Thank you so much for coming on.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. I hope I give some folks a little bit of entertainment on the way.
Well, there you go. Cheers, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks very much.